For a beginner, it's vast. So what I would say, just in the first opening here, is that see if you get into the subject of Egyptology. Understand that it's going to be lifelong study. Know this from the off. It's not going to be something that you're going to master in half an hour or 1 year or 2 years. To get into the subject means a lifelong study of collecting numerous books, and some of them are even dated, back to the 17th and 1800s and what have you. And also look out for another major problem. And that is that you're going to now, especially if you get into more of the Gerald Massey side of it, right? And that is you're now going to come upon, and answers your question directly, why there would be a hegemonic control over it, is because the Roman Church will just fucking atomize. If you, being from a Catholic family or whatever, start researching Egypt, which is, as Jordan Maxwell and others have pointed out, nothing but the hidden manual of where it all comes from. Jesus, the solar king, the crucifixion, a God being the word of God, a God resting on the seventh day. In fact, even concepts of a 6-day creation, a primordial hill, right? A primordial hill rising out of the water. When we just earlier spoke about that, it's all dedicated to the goddess. Yeah, well, what are those primordial waters that all creation came out of? Primordial waters was who? That was a goddess Nun, right? That's how basic it becomes. But the utterance of a holy word that the Bible fixates on, that God created with. Do you know where that came from? Egypt, right? You know what I mean? We all know this now. Hopefully we should. Horus is the good shepherd. Go to my astrotheology site if you're new to this and in doubt. Concepts of the afterlife. Concepts even about the nature of God or the gods. The phallic element in religion. Let's start there, Roman Catholicism. You got a big phallic obelisk right in the middle of Vatican Center. Let's walk over that and start the lecture.
Yeah.
See what happens?
Okay.
Oh, and you got 13 other ones in the same city. Right. So let's just start with that.
And they're all over the
towers,
world.
They're all over the world. Let's just start with that. And it goes back to Egypt. You're going to, what is the pyramid if not a tower? What about the Ankh and the symbol of the cross? What about the serpent symbol that turns up in the book of Genesis? What about the concept of resurrection? There's chief god Osiris resurrected after a period in the underworld. What about the original Eden? It was known as the Elysian Fields, or the originals, the fields of Aru. What about the concept of everlasting soul? What about the concept of burial in the ground? What about the concept of the underworld? Jesus harrowing hell. Shall I go on? If you do, I'll have to deliver a ton of books at your door. The Godfrey Higginses, right? The Gerald Masseys, the Alvin Boyd Carr. You ready to deliver? We got a delivery for you there, Mr. Joe Sixpack. So this is what I'm saying. If you're going to get into the subject, right, you better build a couple of extra garages. What about the confessions of, the hymns of Imhotep? What about the 42 negative confessions that are the basis of the Song of Solomon and the 10 Commandments? Oh, you're ready for that? Are you ready for the Book of the Dead? From which chapters and chapters and chapters, right, can be found in the Bible, the Song of Solomon and all the rest of it.
The Psalms.
Are you ready? Even if you're not coming from theology, but you're coming from philosophy, get ready, because metaphysical dualism. Where do you think that came from? A whole school of people who understood the nature of duality. In their two lands, the two crowns, the overworld and underworld, this life and the next life. The two human natures, personified, say, by Horus and Set, but there's 100 other manifestations of it. You see where I'm going with this? So why would you want to get into a subject that's going to alienate you from every structure that your parents have introduced you to? Now, let's look at it from the flip side. Why should you? Well, there you go. Because now, since our culture and civilization is melting and we might need people to rebuild it from scratch, might it not be good to study a civilization who had it done right from the first time? That's what your Velikovskys and Beaumonts and what Masseys were trying to do. But that entails two things then. Now we're looking at it from the flip side. Why to get into Egyptian culture? Well, one is what we mentioned earlier, and that is because it requires, as an absolute mainstay, a deep and abiding love of nature. Both the stars above your head and the earth under your feet. In fact, we'll get into a concept later as we go about the healing of the earth that all Druidic and pan-Druidic groups were into. This has a lot to do with why the pyramid's there, by the way. We'll get into that later. And it gets you into mathematics in the hard geometric way. But that opens doors then into enlightenment. So one is an abiding heart-based reconnectivity to the universe in which you live and the planet in which you're born, right? And then as a more formulaic process, starting when you were young, if parents knew what the fuck they were doing, this would start young, is an interest in sacred geometry. So that when you walked into the mainstream schools to learn algebra and arithmetic and all that, you're already at a master's level. You are one of the sages. Because you can look at their shit, what is this fucking shite? And then all you do with it is go and build those brutalistic structures out there, or that psychotic art. So there's many things, two of which I've just mentioned, that would be on the flip side why you would get in. I think a third one would be that you would be already now very much primed in your teens to be interested in the esoteric tradition. So you'd be off to a good start all three ways. You'd be into the earth, you'd be into geometry, and you'd be probably an esotericist from a very young age, because there's a holy work to be done. And Egypt is all about a holy gesture and a symbolic gesture. And just one last thing about that, and it's about a pitfall. Many Gnostics have co-opted the story of Egypt in regards to what we're talking about, right? The mythos. And this is wrong, because Egyptians are not Gnostics. Never were, never were. So one Berlin Wall of lies you also have to go through as the novice. I definitely have to mention this for people who are getting into it new, is that they're not Gnostics, because Gnosticism has surrounded the subject of Egypt, hoping that you'll buy into what they have to say. And this could take you years to get in and out of. It's a labyrinth of stuff. I don't say don't read it or don't look at it. It's valuable, right? Read Han Jonas and some of these other great writers. But don't get caught there, because there's a big difference. We've spoken about this, you and I, before, about the difference between Gnosticism and Hermeticism. Obviously, the Egyptians cannot be Gnostics, because this meticulous observance of nature proves it. Gnostics think of the earth as the cage of the soul, a place that's black and demonic and needs to be get away from faster than possible. Well, if you believe that, you don't build pyramids. You don't observe insects. You don't observe the nature of the elephant and the crocodile and the baboon. You don't look at the stars and measure them for 36,000 fucking years, one star. Or any of the other things we know the Egyptians did. Also, the temperament of the Egyptians, if you read Mustafa Gadal and other people who talk about ordinary life in Egypt, these were buoyant, optimistic, happy people. Gnostics are not any of those things. They're in a cage of the soul. They tend to be much more dour and all of that. Can't elaborate the point, but I'm just sketching it out that they're Hermeticists. Hermeticists are meticulously observing nature, because nature is the teacher. Right? The Supreme Spirit created nature. That's where we find ourselves. So by studying the creation, we understand the language of God. That's where the Egyptians were. That's Hermeticism, not Gnosticism. So just, again, bear these few things in mind, and it'll save you on your journey into this extraordinary mystery.
Absolutely. And you were mentioning that concept of the esoteric tradition. We've spoken many times about those definitions of having something that's exoteric, which is sort of like that surface layer, entry level, and then you have the deep meaning behind it. It's almost like the left brain, right brain split personified when you're studying myth. And that's why a lot of people err in the idea of myth, because they'll look at Egypt and they'll go, oh, they're just writing a bunch of myths. And then that's where the scientific mind stops. But a holistic brain, which is how the Egyptians would have encapsulated all of their philosophy and all of their knowledge, they would have delivered information in both ways. They would have delivered it in this is a literal, this world, real world, nature sense. And then here is the subtextual, here's the esoteric, here's the deep meaning behind it all. So if you're just looking at a pyramid or a hieroglyph and you're like, yeah, look at that, like you're saying, get out the protractor and the rulers and all that. But if you're not realizing there's meaning there's something, it means something. It's not just some scrawling on the ground by a bunch of primitive apes. This is what they want you to believe, that there's something more to it. That's where you can get lost in the woods if you leave the esoteric side of it out. So you were talking about the fact that Egypt was the home of dualism. They were studying dualism. That would be another dualism, would it not? The surface level and the esoteric level, right?
Absolutely. The pillars of the Temple of Solomon, all of the temples on the Nile had the pillars, the dualism, right. the banks of the Nile, all of that were considered red and black. The two colors were prominent. Red, the banks, red being mostly evil, connected with the god Set, and black being fertile and good and initiation, Kem, the black land, which leads to chemistry with geometry and all of that. So this was an incredible, and then just the simple fact of the mystery schools along the Nile. This can't be doubted. And since any of the things that matter in Egypt have any antecedent stages that can be found, it's quite preposterous even to listen to the hegemonic, statements where they talk about it only being 2,000 to 3,000 years BC. Yes, some of the stuff is from that period. But obviously if you call yourself a scientist and academic, and you find that some of the more marvelous anomalies not only are existing there, but the key point I just mentioned, where are the antecedent stages that must have been there to get to that level of sophistication? How can you then be saying it all happened 3,000 BC? Aren't you institutionalized then? Well, you never ever, right? You never contradict the institutionalized idiot. That's what you learn. They're the crowd. If we can't explain it, you're not meant to ask it.
Right.
Now, hopefully, gladly, gratefully, happily, the human race, some of them have said, fuck off. Just fuck the fuck off. If you can't answer it, I'm not meant to ask it.